In the Brandywine Valley of Delaware stands a mansion that tells two stories. The first is visible to anyone who visits, a French chateau of breathtaking beauty, with gilded rooms filled with treasures from the court of Louis XVI and gardens that rival Versailles itself. The second story is written in broken glass. Around the 300-acre estate runs a wall, 9 feet of stone, topped with shards of bottles embedded in concrete. Sharp, unforgiving. A barrier that says, "Keep out." This was Nemours, built between 1909 and 1910 by Alfred Vasseur Dupont, one of America's wealthiest men. 47,000 square feet, 77 rooms, architects from New York's most prestigious firm, gardens designed by masters, every detail perfection. But Alfred didn't build Nemours to welcome the world. He built it to shut his family out. The Duponts were American royalty, descendants of French nobility who had built a gunpowder empire that armed the Union Army and made them one of the richest families in the nation. They lived together in Delaware, their mansions clustered along the Brandywine River like a private kingdom. Marriages between cousins kept the fortune in the family. Business stayed in the family. Everything stayed in the family. Until Alfred broke the rules. His crime? Divorcing his first wife to marry his cousin. A divorced cousin. Delaware society recoiled. His relatives chose sides. The family that had stood together for a century split down the middle. And when Alfred built his palace for his new bride, he made sure every Dupont who had rejected them would see it from outside those walls, from outside that glass. This is the story of Nemours, a mansion built on love, scandal, tragedy, and ultimately, redemption. Where broken glass became a symbol of a broken family, and where that same family's fortune would eventually heal thousands of children. Welcome to the estate Alfred Dupont built to keep the world away. Chapter 1. The Wall with Broken Glass. The wall came first, before the mansion rose, before the gardens took shape, before a single stone was laid for the chateau that would become Alfred Dupont's monument to defiance. The wall went up, 9 feet of solid stone, running along Rockland Road, enclosing 300 acres of Delaware farmland. But stone alone wasn't enough. Alfred wanted something more. Something that would make a statement every time his relatives drove past. So he ordered his workers to embed broken bottles in the concrete cap. Green glass, brown glass, clear glass. Thousands of jagged shards, their edges pointing skyward like teeth. To keep out the other Duponts, he reportedly told his architects. It was said as a joke. The architects didn't laugh. By 1909, when construction on Nemours began, the Dupont family civil war had been raging for 3 years. Alfred's divorce from his first wife Bessie and his marriage to his twice-divorced cousin Alicia had split the clan into camps. Cousins who had grown up together now refused to speak. Brothers took opposite sides. The women, those arbiters of society who decided who was received and who was shunned, had made their verdict clear. Alicia Dupont would never be welcomed in their homes. So Alfred built her a home they couldn't ignore, one they would see, one they would envy, one that would stand as a permanent reminder that he had the money, the taste, and the vision to create something more magnificent than any of their tired old Brandywine mansions. That barrier made sure they understood. They weren't invited. Nemours took its name from the town in north-central France where Alfred's great-great-grandfather, Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours, had served in the French Estates General before fleeing the Revolution. Pierre Samuel had been minor nobility, not grand enough to lose his head, but connected enough to need an escape. He brought his family to America in 1800, and his son Eleuthère Irénée founded the gunpowder company that would make the DuPont name synonymous with American industry. 4 generations later, Alfred wanted to reclaim that French heritage. Not the revolutionary part, the aristocratic part. The part that said the DuPonts were more than merchants who got rich selling explosives. They were descended from nobility. They had culture. They had refinement. Alicia loved the idea. She had always been a Francophile, drawn to the elegance of the French court, the art of the 18th century, the architecture of the Ancien Régime. When asked what kind of house she wanted, her answer was immediate: French. A chateau in the style of Louis XVI. Something that would have looked at home in the gardens of Versailles. Carrère and Hastings were hired, the most celebrated architectural firm in America. They had designed the New York Public Library, the Frick Mansion on Fifth Avenue, Whitehall, Henry Flagler's Palace in Palm Beach. If you wanted to announce you had arrived at the pinnacle of American society, you hired Carrère and Hastings. They delivered exactly what was requested. A limestone chateau, 5 stories tall, with a facade that could have been transplanted from the Loire Valley. Symmetrical and classical with restrained ornamentation, but unmistakably grand. A building that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. 47,000 square feet, 77 rooms, more space than Alfred and Alicia could ever use, but that wasn't the point. Scale mattered. Presence mattered. This was a statement. I belong here. Construction took just over a year. Smith and Son, local contractors from Wilmington, managed the build. Stone masons shaped Indiana limestone. Craftsmen installed windows shipped from France. Plasterers worked on ceilings that would be gilded and painted. Floor by floor, the structure rose, its roofline visible for miles. And all around it, that 9-foot barrier, topped with glass that caught the sunlight and glittered like diamonds. Neighbors whispered about it. Reporters wrote about it. Other DuPonts pretended not to notice, but everyone knew exactly what it meant. A family that had made its fortune on gunpowder had found a new weapon: architecture. And Alfred Dupont was making sure his relatives felt every cut from that broken glass. When Nemours was finally complete in 1910, Alfred and Alicia moved in. The mansion gleamed. The gardens were still raw, but the bones were there, the long central axis that would eventually stretch 1/3 of a mile from the house to the reflecting pool. The boxwood parterre that would take years to mature. The temple of love that would house a statue of Diana. It was everything they had dreamed of. A French palace in Delaware, their own private Versailles. A home that announced they had taste, money, and the courage to thumb their noses at anyone who disapproved. But palaces, Alfred would learn, don't protect you from tragedy. And walls, even walls topped with broken glass, can't keep out grief. Chapter 2. The Orphan Who Became a Powder Man. Alfred Irénée Dupont was 13 years old when his world ended. It happened in stages. First, his mother. Charlotte Henderson Dupont had always been fragile, prone to what the relatives called episodes. Depression, they would say now. In 1877, when Alfred was 13, the episodes grew worse. She stopped eating, stopped speaking. Her eyes lost focus. The relatives sent her to a Philadelphia asylum. Alfred watched his mother disappear into a carriage, watched it roll away down the drive at Swamp Hall. He never saw her again. She died there a week later. 1 month after that, his father followed. Eleuthère Irénée Dupont II had been dying slowly for years, tuberculosis eating through his lungs, holding on long enough to see his wife buried, then giving up. Alfred was 14 when they lowered his father into the ground beside his mother at the Dupont Cemetery. 5 children orphaned. Guardians arrived at Swamp Hall with a plan. The children would be separated, sent to different relatives. The house would be sold. It was practical. It made sense. Duponts took care of their own, but 5 children in one house with no parents? Impossible. The children disagreed. According to accounts passed down through the clan, when Uncle Fred, Alfred Victor Dupont, the crusty old bachelor who managed their affairs, came to tell them the decision, he found the 5 Dupont children waiting at the door. Armed with garden tools and kitchen utensils, they refused to leave. Alfred's older sisters had been running the household for years already. They had servants. They had money from their father's estate. They didn't need to be saved. Uncle Fred, reportedly surprised by their determination, relented. The girls could stay, but Alfred and his brothers would go to boarding school. At 14, Alfred was sent to Shin Academy in New Jersey, a religious school where he lasted exactly 1 miserable year. Then Phillips Academy at Andover, Massachusetts, where he fared slightly better. Books bored him. He wasn't a natural student. What excited him was machinery, tools, anything that moved or could be made to move. After graduating, he enrolled at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His cousin T. Coleman DuPont was already there, and Alfred shared a room with him. They were an odd pair, Coleman loud and gregarious, Alfred quiet and mischievous, but they got along well enough. 2 years later, Alfred left MIT without graduating. Not because he failed, because the powder mills called him home. In 1884, at age 20, Alfred DuPont walked into the Brandywine Mills and started at the bottom. The very bottom. Hauling materials, driving wagons, working alongside the powder men who risked their lives every day mixing chemicals that could detonate if you looked at them wrong. The other DuPonts, the ones who ran the company from mahogany desks in Wilmington, thought it was beneath him. A DuPont working like a common laborer? Alfred didn't care what they thought. The mill workers felt more real to him than his uptight relatives. These men worked with their hands, understood machinery. When a mill exploded, and explosions happened regularly, killing workers by the dozens, these men went back the next day and rebuilt. Alfred learned everything they could teach him. How powder behaved. How to read the signs that a batch was going bad. How to design equipment that was safer, more efficient. His mind worked differently than the gentleman scientists who ran the laboratories. Engineering came naturally, making things work in the real world, not just on paper. Over the next decade, Alfred became recognized as one of the nation's leading black powder experts. Chemistry, mechanics, and most importantly, danger. All three were intimately familiar to him. Carrying bodies out of demolished buildings taught lessons the executives could never learn. That knowledge made him careful in ways they would never be. Inventing followed naturally. Improvements to mixing equipment. Safer ways to transport powder. Better methods for preventing static buildup. Over his lifetime, Alfred would register over 200 patents, most of them related to manufacturing explosives. In 1887, at age 23, Alfred married his cousin Bessie Gardner. It was expected. DuPonts married DuPonts. It kept the money in the clan. It simplified the corporate structure. Love was secondary to practicality. They had 4 children together. The marriage was not happy. Bessie wanted a gentleman, someone who would manage wealth from an office, host dinner parties, play the role of DuPont aristocrat. Alfred wanted to be in the mills, covered in powder dust, solving problems, building things, leading the workers' band, socializing with the laborers, naming his house Swamp Hall to mock the pretentious names his relatives gave their estates. Bessie was embarrassed. Her husband was rich but acted like a workman. The other DuPont wives whispered. Alfred didn't care, or told himself he didn't. In 1889, the company reorganized. It became A.E. DuPont de Nemours and Company, a formal corporation. Alfred was made a limited partner. Beyond that, the elders largely ignored him. No board seat, no say in company policy. Useful in the mills, but real power belonged to Eugene DuPont and the older generation. For the next 13 years, Alfred stayed in the background, working, inventing, growing increasingly distant from Bessie, watching his cousins accumulate power while he stayed in the mills with the powder men. Then, in 1902, Eugene DuPont died. The old patriarch's death threw the company into crisis. He had been the last of his generation running the business. The remaining elders looked at the books and made a decision. Sell. Sell the company to Laughlin and Rand, their biggest competitor. Take the money. Be done with it. Alfred heard the news and exploded with rage. Sell the enterprise? To outsiders? The company his great-grandfather had founded a century ago? Not while he was alive. At 38 years old, Alfred the Thirster DuPont was about to make his move. The powder man was ready to become a power broker, and he would need his cousins, 2 very different cousins, to help him do it. The orphan who had learned his trade at the bottom of the mills was about to take control of an empire. Chapter 3. 3 Cousins Buy an Empire. The meeting happened in Alfred's office at the Brandywine Mills. February 1902. Eugene Dupont had been dead less than a month, and the family elders were already negotiating with Laughlin and Rand. Alfred sat behind his desk and looked at the two men he'd summoned, his cousins, the only two Duponts he thought might be crazy enough to help him. Thomas Coleman Dupont. Everyone called him Coleman or Coley. Big, loud, athletic. A backslapping extrovert who could charm anyone and never doubted himself for a second. He'd left Delaware years ago to make his fortune in Kentucky, building streetcar companies and real estate developments. He'd succeeded. Coleman knew how to make money and loved doing it. Pierre Samuel Dupont. Quiet. Methodical. A numbers man. While Coleman worked crowds and made deals, Pierre built spreadsheets and analyzed returns. He'd been working as Coleman's secretary, managing the financial details of Coleman's various enterprises. If Coleman was the salesman, Pierre was the accountant who made sure the books balanced. And Alfred? Alfred was the engineer, the one who understood how things actually worked, the one who knew powder. The proposition was simple but audacious. They would buy the company themselves, all three of them. The problem was equally simple. They didn't have $12 million. Nobody had $12 million just lying around, not even DuPont's. Alfred had been thinking about the mechanics for weeks. They would form a new company and issue bonds to the old stockholders in exchange for their shares. 4% yield, same as the current dividend. Most of them would take it. Bonds paid first if anything went wrong, safer than stock. They would sweeten the deal with 25% in stock of the new company. The remaining 75% would be split between the three cousins, with Coleman getting half and Alfred and Pierre splitting the other half. It was brilliant. Risky, but brilliant. They would buy a $12 million company with almost none of their own money. The bondholders would finance the purchase. If it worked, they'd control one of America's largest industrial companies. If it failed, they'd be ruined. Pierre worried about it. Coleman loved it. Alfred knew it was their only chance. According to Coleman's later account, Pierre had only 3 minutes to decide on the phone before committing. He said yes. Now they had to convince the family. The elders were skeptical. Alfred Dupont, the one who worked in the mills like a common laborer, wanted to run the company? Coleman, who'd abandoned Delaware for Kentucky? Pierre, who was barely 30 years old? But the alternative was selling to outsiders. And that ultimately was unacceptable. The DuPont company had been in the family for a century. If it had to be sold, better to young DuPonts than to strangers. In March 1902, the deal closed. Coleman became president. Pierre became treasurer. Alfred became vice president in charge of operations, which meant he ran the powder mills, the part of the business he actually understood. They owed nearly $12 million. They personally owned less than $700 each in actual stock. Everything rode on their ability to make the enterprise profitable enough to service the debt. Coleman reorganized the corporate structure. Pierre modernized the accounting. Alfred revolutionized the mills. He knew where the inefficiencies were. He'd been watching them for 18 years. Equipment that broke down constantly. Processes that wasted materials. Safety protocols that existed on paper but were ignored in practice. He fixed them, one by one. He also knew the competition. Laughlin and Rand wasn't the only rival. Dozens of smaller powder companies dotted the eastern United States. The industry was fragmented, competitive, dangerous, not just because of the explosions, but because price wars were driving everyone's margins down. The cousins decided to consolidate. Over the next 3 years, they acquired reportedly over 50 other companies. They bought competitors. They bought suppliers. They bought distribution networks. By 1905, DuPont controlled 75% of the American gunpowder market. The government noticed. In 1912, the Justice Department filed an antitrust suit. Too much control, they said. Violation of the Sherman Act. DuPont was ordered to divest some of its assets. The corporation complied, spinning off 2 smaller competitors. It hurt, but DuPont remained dominant. Through it all, the 3 cousins worked together. Not always harmoniously, they were too different for that, but effectively. Coleman ran the front office. He was the public face, the deal maker. the one who negotiated with banks and suppliers and government officials. He loved the spotlight and was good in it. Pierre ran the finances. He built DuPont into a modern corporation with professional management, clear reporting structures, and return on investment as the primary metric for every decision. He turned a family business into an industrial machine. Alfred ran operations. He was in the mills every day, still getting powder dust on his clothes, still working alongside the men who mixed the chemicals and packed the cartridges. He installed new equipment, improved safety protocols, made the enterprise more efficient. It worked. The bonds got paid. The corporation grew. Within 5 years, the cousins had turned their leveraged buyout into one of the great business success stories of the early 20th century. But success breeds tension, always. Coleman was president, but he wanted more. He had political ambitions. He built roads, literally, at his own expense. He built a highway from Wilmington to Lewis because he was tired of dirt roads. He eyed the governor's mansion, then the Senate. Pierre wanted control. He was methodical, patient, willing to wait. But he believed DuPont needed professional management, not family sentiment. Decisions should be made by data, not by who your grandfather was. Alfred wanted respect. He'd saved the enterprise. He'd made it work. But Coleman and Pierre were the ones getting credit. Coleman was the charming deal-maker. Pierre was the financial genius. Alfred was just the guy in the mills. The crack started small. Disagreements about strategy, arguments about expansion, Coleman pushing for growth, Pierre urging caution. Alfred caught between them. By 1909, when Alfred was building Nemours, the tension was palpable. The cousins still worked together. They still made money together. But the friendship was fraying. In 1914, everything would fall apart. But in those early years, in the decade after they bought the business, the three cousins who had staged one of America's first leveraged buyouts had proven they could do the impossible. They'd bought an empire with borrowed money, and they'd made it work. For a while. Chapter 4. The Scandal That Split the Family. Alfred DuPont was 42 years old when he decided he couldn't live a lie anymore. The marriage to Bessie had been dead for years. They lived in the same house, raised 4 children together, attended the same church on Sundays. But they were strangers sharing an address. Bessie wanted a society husband. Alfred wanted to be left alone to work in his mills. Neither was getting what they wanted. Then there was Alicia. Mary Alicia Hayward Bradford was Alfred's second cousin. She'd married George Amory Maddox, another DuPont cousin, in 1896. The marriage hadn't been happy either. George was often absent. Alicia was lonely. And Alfred, working long hours at the mills and avoiding his own unhappy home, found himself spending more and more time at the Maddox residence. They were friends first, then something more. The relatives noticed. Whispers started. In a clan as tightly knit as the DuPonts, where everyone watched everyone else, secrets didn't last long. In 1906, Alfred was on a hunting trip in Virginia with friends. Someone's gun went off accidentally. The blast hit Alfred in the face. He lost his left eye. The injury was serious enough that he spent weeks recovering in a hospital, and during that time he made a decision. Life was short. He'd nearly died. He wasn't going to waste whatever years he had left pretending to be happy in a marriage that made him miserable. He filed for divorce from Bessie. In 1906, divorce was scandalous enough. But Alfred made it worse. He gave Bessie a week's notice to vacate Swamp Hall, the house where they'd raised their children. Then he had the building demolished. Not just emptied, demolished. He ordered the walls torn down, the foundations removed, every trace of the structure erased from the property. It was cruel, vindictive, and it told everyone exactly how bitter things had become. Bessie moved with their 4 children to a smaller house. Alfred gave her $24,000 a year in support, a substantial sum, but he cut off contact with all of them except his eldest daughter, Madeleine. The DuPont women were horrified. Destroying the household and abandoning your children, unforgivable. They rallied around Bessie. Doors that had been open to Alfred began to close. Then, in January 1907, came the second scandal. George Maddox filed for divorce from Alicia, citing Alfred's relationship with his wife. The accusations were public. What had been gossip became newspaper headlines. To avoid further embarrassment, Alfred reportedly paid George $1 million to divorce Alicia quietly and leave for Europe. 2 weeks after Alicia's divorce was final, she married Alfred. The wedding was quiet, small. Not because they wanted it that way, but because almost no one came. The Dupont relatives who had built their lives around propriety and reputation were not going to celebrate this union. Alicia was divorced. Alfred was divorced. They'd been involved while both were still married. And now they had the audacity to marry each other? Delaware society shut them out. The Dupont matriarchs made their positions clear. Alicia would not be received in their homes. Invitations stopped coming. When Alfred and Alicia appeared at gatherings, conversations died. People left rooms. Alfred responded with lawsuits. He sued several relatives for slander, claiming they'd spread lies about him and Alicia. The cases dragged through the courts for months before Alfred eventually dropped them. The legal battles didn't help. If anything, they made the rift worse. His cousins took sides. Coleman and Pierre, his business partners, supported Bessie. They built her and the children a new home after the destruction of Swamp Hall. Other Duponts aligned with Alfred or stayed neutral, but the majority sided with Bessie. She was the wronged woman. Alfred was the villain who had abandoned his children for a twice-divorced cousin. Shortly after the wedding came another disaster. A DuPont powder plant in Fontenette, Indiana, exploded. Over 24 workers died. Alfred and Alicia cut short any celebration to travel to Indiana. He inspected the ruins, met with the families of the dead, arranged for compensation. Then he ordered the plant permanently closed. The safety record had been abysmal. He was disgusted. The tragedy cast a shadow over everything. It felt like an omen. Alfred and Alicia returned to Delaware to face a society that didn't want them. The mansion Alfred had inherited wasn't enough. It wasn't theirs. It carried too much history, too many memories of Bessie and the children. He decided to build something new, something that would be unmistakably theirs, a statement that said they belonged, that they had taste and money, and the right to be taken seriously. If the clan wouldn't accept them, he would build a palace so magnificent they'd have no choice but to acknowledge it. Alicia loved France. She loved French culture, French art, French architecture. Alfred wanted to honor his ancestors' French heritage. They agreed on the vision immediately. A chateau that wouldn't look out of place in the Loire Valley, something that would rival anything the other Duponts had built. They would call it Nemours, after the French town associated with Alfred's great-great-grandfather. And they would surround it with a wall, 9 feet of stone, topped with broken glass, a barrier that kept the judgmental world outside. Construction began in 1909. By then, Alfred and Alicia had been married for 2 years. 2 years of isolation from the relatives they'd grown up with. 2 years of whispers and closed doors and knowing they were discussed in every DuPont drawing room in Delaware. The mansion would be their answer. It would be so beautiful, so perfect, so undeniably grand that no one could ignore it. It would prove they belonged, that they had won. What they didn't know, as the limestone walls rose floor by floor, was that the greatest tragedies were still ahead. The beautiful chateau they were building would witness sorrows that no amount of French elegance could soften, and the wall with broken glass would keep out the relatives, but it couldn't keep out grief. Chapter 5. Architects of the Gilded Age. Alfred needed architects who understood grandeur, not just builders who could stack stone, but artists who could create a statement. Men who had built for Vanderbilts and Rockefellers, men whose names meant prestige. He chose Carrère and Hastings. By 1909, when Alfred approached them about Nemours, the firm was at the peak of its reputation. They'd won the competition for the New York Public Library in 1897, beating out McKim, Mead, and White, the most prestigious architectural firm in America. That victory had established them as masters of the Beaux-Arts style, the elegant French classicism that defined Gilded Age architecture. John Mervyn Carrère and Thomas Hastings had met as students at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Carrère, born in Brazil to American parents, graduated in 1882. Hastings, a New Yorker, followed in 1884. Both returned to the United States and worked for McKim, Mead, and White before starting their own practice in 1886. Their partnership combined complementary talents. Carrère handled the business side, managing client relationships and negotiations. Hastings was the creative force, drawing and refining each project. Together, they built a practice that defined American architecture in the decades around 1900. Their first major commission came from Henry Flagler, the oil magnate developing Florida's East Coast. Flagler hired them for the Ponce de Leon Hotel in St. Augustine. Completed in 1888, the building established the firm's reputation. It was grand but not gaudy, classical but not stiff, exactly what wealthy Americans wanted when they commissioned monuments to their success. The projects multiplied. Residences for the Whitneys and the Paynes, office buildings in New York, the Senate and House office buildings in Washington. Each reinforced their reputation as the go-to choice for clients with power and money. In 1913, they would complete the Henry Clay Frick residence on Fifth Avenue in New York. The house would later become the Frick Collection, one of America's great art museums. Like Nemours, it followed French neoclassical principles: restrained elegance, perfect proportions. The kind of structure that announced wealth through refinement rather than excess. The firm understood what men like Alfred Dupont needed. These clients weren't just buying houses, they were buying legitimacy. Proof that they belonged among America's elite, that their fortunes came with taste and culture, not just bank accounts. The Beaux-Arts style was perfect for this purpose. It drew on French architectural traditions from the 17th and 18th centuries, the era of Louis XIV and Louis XVI. It emphasized symmetry, classical proportions, elaborate but controlled decoration. Buildings in this style said, "We understand European culture. We're not just rich Americans, we're sophisticated." When Alfred and Alicia met with the firm about Nemours, the response was immediate. Alfred wanted French, Alicia wanted chateau. They both wanted something that would silence their critics by being undeniably magnificent. The proposal called for a 5-story limestone structure in the style of Louis XVI. The facade would be symmetrical, with tall windows and a central entrance. The roofline would be steep, in the French manner. The proportions would follow classical ratios refined over centuries. Inside, the rooms would flow in the traditional French arrangement for entertaining and display. 47,000 square feet, 77 rooms, large enough to impress, but not so large that it became vulgar. The trick was walking the line between impressive and excessive. Carrère and Hastings had mastered this balance in previous commissions. The drawings were exquisite, elevations showing how the structure would appear from every angle, floor plans detailing the arrangement of rooms, cross-sections revealing the construction method, floor by floor. Alfred and Alicia studied them and approved immediately. This matched their vision exactly. Construction would be handled by Smith & Son, a Wilmington firm with experience on large projects. The firm would supervise, ensuring every detail matched their specifications. Stone would be quarried and shaped. Windows would be manufactured to precise dimensions. Craftsmen would install plasterwork and woodwork according to centuries-old techniques. The process would take over a year. The budget was substantial, though exact figures were never made public. Estimates suggested the project cost well over $2 million, an enormous sum for 1910. But Alfred had the resources, and more importantly, the determination to create something lasting. Carrère and Hastings were creating more than a house. They were building a legacy, a structure that would stand for generations, announcing that Alfred the Fur Dupont had belonged among America's greatest families, that he had taste, that he understood beauty and culture and the weight of history. The partnership delivered everything Alfred and Alicia wanted, a French chateau that wouldn't have looked out of place in the Loire Valley, a residence that rivaled anything built by the Vanderbilts or the Rockefellers. A home that made everyone who saw it understand. The people who lived here mattered. Tragically, John Carrere would never see Nemours completed. In March 1911, while construction continued, he was involved in a streetcar accident in New York City. He passed away from his injuries on March 1st. Thomas Hastings continued the practice alone, completing Nemours and many other projects over the next 18 years before his own passing in 1929. But Nemours stands as testament to their partnership, a perfect example of what Gilded Age architects could achieve when given substantial resources and clients who valued beauty. The structure remains one of their finest works, fulfilling every promise the drawings had made. Chapter 6. Building a French Dream in Delaware. Ground was broken in the spring of 1909. 300 acres of Delaware farmland, most of it flat and featureless, would be transformed into something extraordinary. But first came the wall. Alfred insisted on it. 9 feet of stone, running the entire perimeter of the property along Rockland Road. The barrier went up before the first foundation was dug, before a single limestone block arrived for the house itself. And on top of that wall, workers embedded thousands of broken bottle shards in concrete. Green glass, brown glass, clear glass, all of it pointing skyward with jagged edges. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Everyone in Delaware understood what it meant. With the wall complete, actual construction could begin. Smith & Son, the Wilmington contractors, took charge of the building process. They had experience with large projects, though nothing quite like this. Carrere and Hastings sent detailed specifications from their New York office. Every measurement had to be exact. Every material had to meet their standards. The first challenge was the foundation. 47,000 square feet of structure required substantial support. Workers excavated deep into the Delaware soil, removing tons of earth to create a level base. The foundation itself would be reinforced concrete and stone, designed to carry the weight of 5 stories plus the limestone facade. Limestone became the defining material. Indiana limestone quarried in the Midwest and shipped east by rail. The stone arrived in massive blocks, each weighing hundreds of pounds. Stonemasons set up workshops on site, shaping the blocks to precise dimensions. Every piece had to fit exactly. The French classical style demanded perfect proportions. A window opening that was too wide or too narrow would destroy the symmetry. The masons were craftsmen, not just laborers. Many had trained in Europe, learning techniques passed down through generations. They understood how to cut stone so it would weather properly, how to create joints that would remain tight for decades, how to carve decorative elements that would survive Delaware winters. Their work would determine whether Nemours looked like a genuine French chateau or an expensive imitation. As the walls rose, floor by floor, the scale became apparent. This wasn't just large, it was massive. The facade stretched across the property, dominating the landscape. Neighbors could see it taking shape from miles away. Every DuPont driving past on Rockland Road had to look at it, had to see those walls climbing higher, that limestone gleaming pale against the Delaware sky. Inside, carpenters framed the interior rooms according to the architect's plans. 77 rooms arranged in the traditional French manner. Public spaces on the lower floors for entertaining. Private spaces above for the family. Service areas tucked discreetly out of sight. The layout followed patterns established in French chateaux centuries earlier, adapted for American life in 1910. Plasterwork came next. Ceilings would be elaborately decorated, some with molded designs, others destined for gilding and paint. Walls received multiple coats, each sanded smooth before the next application. The plaster had to dry properly between coats, which meant work progressed slowly. Rush the process, and cracks would appear within months. Do it right, and the surfaces would remain perfect for generations. Windows arrived from specialized manufacturers. Tall, multi-paned windows in the French style. Each one custom-made to fit its opening exactly. The glass itself was exceptionally clear, allowing maximum light into the rooms. The frames were wood, painted to match the interior color scheme Alicia was planning. The roof presented its own challenges. French chateaux had steep roof lines, sometimes approaching 60 degrees. That steepness looked elegant, but created practical problems. Snow and rain would slide off easily, but the construction required specialized carpentry. The roof structure had to be engineered to support its own weight, plus snow loads, while maintaining that dramatic pitch. Slate tiles covered the roof. Dark gray slate, imported and expensive. Each tile was hand-cut and individually attached. Thousands of pieces fitted together like an enormous puzzle. The work was dangerous. Men balanced on steep surfaces 5 stories above the ground, often in wind and weather. Falls happened. Injuries happened. But the work continued. By the summer of 1910, after more than a year of construction, the exterior was nearly complete. The limestone facade was finished. The roof was on. The windows were in. From the outside, Nemours looked ready. The reality was different. The interior remained unfinished. Rooms were empty shells. Mechanical systems needed installation. The real work of turning a building into a livable home was just beginning. Heating required a complete system of boilers and radiators. Electricity had to be wired throughout, with switches and fixtures in every room. Plumbing meant running pipes through walls and floors, connecting bathrooms and kitchens to the main supply. In 1910, these systems were still relatively new in residential construction. Many large houses still relied on gas lighting and coal heating. Alfred wanted the most modern systems available. The contractors worked through the fall and into early winter. Painters applied finish coats. Woodworkers installed molding and trim. Tile setters laid floors in bathrooms. Metal workers fitted brass hardware on doors. Every trade had its role, and every role had to be completed before Alicia could begin furnishing the rooms with the French antiques she'd been acquiring. The total cost was never publicly disclosed. Estimates at the time suggested well over $2 million, though some believed the actual figure was higher. Alfred had the resources. He'd made his fortune in the powder business and was still collecting income from his DuPont shares. Money wasn't the constraint. Perfection was the goal. By late 1910, just over 18 months after breaking ground, Nemours was ready. The chateau Alfred and Alicia had envisioned was real. 5 stories of French elegance rising from Delaware farmland, surrounded by that wall with its crown of broken glass, visible to everyone, accessible to almost no one. The construction had been a statement. Now it was time to see if the statement would be heard. Chapter 7. A Palace of French Treasures. The building was complete. Now came the work of making it magnificent. Alicia had been collecting for years. Even before construction began, she'd been acquiring French antiques through dealers in New York and Paris. Furniture from the 18th century, paintings by old masters, tapestries that had hung in European palaces. Every piece carefully chosen to create the atmosphere she wanted. A French chateau, authentic in every detail. The entrance hall set the tone. Visitors stepping through the massive front doors found themselves in a space designed to impress. Marble floors. White walls with gilded molding. A grand staircase sweeping upward, its balustrade carved from pale stone. The proportions were generous, but not overwhelming. This was elegance, not excess. The ballroom occupied much of the first floor. Large enough to host hundreds of guests, it featured crystal chandeliers hanging from an elaborately decorated ceiling. The plasterwork was painted and gilded, creating patterns that caught the light. Tall windows looked out onto the gardens. The floor was polished wood, perfect for dancing. When empty, the room felt almost austere in its formality. When filled with people, it would come alive. Adjacent to the ballroom was the dining room, where Alfred and Alicia would host the dinners that were expected of wealthy Americans. The table could seat 24 guests comfortably. The walls were paneled in dark wood, creating an intimate atmosphere despite the room's size. Paintings hung in gilded frames. A fireplace provided warmth in winter. The details mattered here. The silver, the china, the linens would all be French, carefully selected to maintain the illusion that this could be a house in the Loire Valley. Alicia filled the rooms with furniture that would have satisfied any French aristocrat. Louis XVI chairs with carved frames and silk upholstery, tables with inlaid woods and ormolu mounts, cabinets displaying porcelain and decorative objects. Every piece was authentic, purchased from European dealers who specialized in period furnishings. She wasn't interested in reproductions. If Nemours was going to be a French chateau, it would contain actual French furniture. One of her prized acquisitions was a clock that had belonged to Marie Antoinette. The timepiece was ornate, gilded bronze with enamel decoration. Whether the provenance was entirely accurate hardly mattered. The story was good, and the clock was certainly old enough and fine enough to have belonged to royalty. It sat in one of the main reception rooms, a conversation piece that impressed visitors. The paintings ranged from portraits of the Dupont family to works by European masters. Alicia preferred 18th and 19th century French and British artists. Nothing too modern or challenging. These were paintings meant to establish taste and culture, not to provoke thought. Landscapes, portraits, still lifes, all expertly executed, all expensive, all appropriate for a house like this. Tapestries covered some walls, adding warmth and color. Medieval and Renaissance scenes, woven centuries ago, now hanging in a Delaware mansion. The juxtaposition was striking. These textiles had witnessed European history. Now they decorated rooms where American industrialists would discuss business and society. The conservatory became one of Nemours' most distinctive spaces. Glass walls and ceiling created a greenhouse effect, allowing Alicia to grow plants year-round. Trellises supported climbing vines. Potted palms and exotic flowers filled the room with green. It was lighter, airier than the formal reception rooms, a place to escape the weight of all that French formality. Upstairs, the private rooms were more modest but still luxurious. Bedrooms with canopied beds and antique armoires, bathrooms with the most modern plumbing available, dressing rooms with built-in storage. These spaces were for family, not for show, but they maintained the same attention to quality that characterized the public areas. The library held Alfred's collection of books and documents related to the Dupont family history. Shelves lined the walls, floor to ceiling. A desk provided workspace. Comfortable chairs allowed for reading. This was Alfred's retreat, the room where he could escape social obligations and focus on his interests. Unlike the formal rooms downstairs, which Alicia controlled, the library was distinctly his. Throughout the house, Alicia paid careful attention to lighting. Crystal chandeliers in the formal rooms, wall sconces in hallways, table lamps in private spaces. Nemours had electricity, a modern convenience that many older mansions lacked. The wiring was hidden, preserving the period aesthetic while providing contemporary comfort. The gates were works of art themselves. One set came from England, elaborate wrought iron painted black. Another set reportedly came from Russia, bearing the imperial crown and dates marking Catherine the Great's reign. Whether these gates had actually graced a Russian palace was uncertain, but they looked impressive and added to Nemours' collection of European treasures. By the time Alfred and Alicia moved in, every room was complete. The furniture was arranged, the paintings hung, the decorative objects displayed. Nemours had become exactly what they'd envisioned. A French palace in Delaware. A house that proved they belonged among America's most cultivated families. But houses, no matter how beautiful, don't guarantee happiness. The treasures Alicia had collected couldn't protect them from the tragedies ahead. The French elegance couldn't soften the sorrows that would fill these rooms. And all the antiques and paintings and gilded furniture in the world couldn't give them what they wanted most. A family. Children who would grow up here. Heirs who would inherit this magnificent house and everything it represented. That dream would prove far more elusive than any French clock or Russian gate. Chapter 8. Gardens Fit for Versailles. The house was only half the vision. Alicia wanted gardens that would match the chateau's grandeur. Not English gardens with their romantic disorder. Not American gardens with their practical layouts. French gardens. Formal, geometric, controlled. Gardens that announced human mastery over nature. She took her inspiration from Versailles. specifically from the gardens surrounding the Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette's private retreat within the vast Versailles complex. Those gardens combined formality with intimacy, grand gestures with carefully composed details. They were designed to impress while remaining human in scale. Carrère and Hastings had included the upper gardens in their original plans. The area immediately adjacent to the house would have terraces and parterres, establishing a transition between architecture and landscape. But the larger garden scheme, the long vista stretching away from the mansion, required additional expertise. The long walk became the organizing principle, a straight path extending from the house, perfectly aligned with the building's central axis. The vista stretched for a third of a mile, terminating at a reflecting pool. This was classic French garden design, a single powerful axis organizing everything around it. The reflecting pool itself was an engineering marvel. 1 acre of water, 40 feet in diameter at its widest point. But this wasn't a simple pond. The pool contained 157 fountain jets, each capable of shooting water 12 feet into the air. When all the fountains operated simultaneously, water and light combined into something alive, constantly changing as the jets pulsed in patterns. The machinery powering those fountains was hidden underground, pumps and pipes all carefully concealed so nothing disrupted the visual effect. The technology was modern, but the aesthetic was pure 18th century. That balance, contemporary engineering producing historical beauty, defined Nemours throughout. Geometric gardens flanked the long walk. Low boxwood hedges shaped into elaborate patterns formed a parterre, the kind of ornamental planting that characterized French estates. The boxwood would take years to mature into the precise geometric forms Alicia envisioned. A fountain with a fawn sculpture marked the center. The maze garden took a different approach. Instead of passive viewing, visitors could enter tall hedges of western arborvitae that twisted and turned through a genuine puzzle. The hedges grew to substantial height, making navigation challenging. At the center stood a statue titled Achievement by sculptor Henri Crenier. The symbolism was apt. Reaching the center required effort, persistence, navigation through difficulty. Much like Alfred's own path to building Nemours. One of the most photographed structures was the Temple of Love. This small neoclassical pavilion, open-sided with classical columns supporting a domed roof, was positioned to be seen from multiple angles. Inside stood a statue of Diana the Huntress, sculpted by Jean-Antoine Houdon, one of the great artists of the 18th century. The marble Diana looked back toward the mansion, bow in hand, forever poised between rest and action. The colonnade came later, built in 1926 as a memorial. Thomas Hastings designed it to honor Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours and his son Eleuthère Irénée Dupont. Classical columns arranged in a semicircle bore inscriptions celebrating the family's French origins. The structure reminded visitors that the Duponts weren't just American industrialists. They descended from French nobility, who had shaped history on both sides of the Atlantic. 2 bronze elk sculptures by French artist Prosper Lecourtier flanked the main vista. The animals stood alert, heads raised, embodying strength and wildness even while frozen in metal. They marked the transition from formal spaces near the house to the more natural landscape beyond. Their placement was deliberate. They drew the eye down the long walk, reinforcing the central axis. Alfred's son Alfred Victor Dupont later added the sunken gardens with landscape architect Gabriel Masséna around 1930. These terraced spaces dropped below the main grade, offering intimate enclosed areas within the larger formal scheme. Stairs descended to different levels, each with distinct plantings and character. Water appeared throughout, not just in the reflecting pool, but in smaller fountains punctuating the geometric layouts. Pools reflected sky and architecture. The sound of water was constant, a burbling presence that softened the formality and added movement to otherwise static spaces. Maintaining this landscape required constant labor. Hedges needed trimming to preserve their precise shapes. Lawns demanded frequent cutting to stay smooth and uniform. Flowers needed planting each season. Fountains required monitoring. French formal gardens weren't natural. They were manufactured landscapes, requiring continuous work to maintain the illusion of effortless perfection. A carillon tower, added after Alfred's death, rose above the landscape. The structure housed bells that could be played manually or automatically. The tower also served as a mausoleum, eventually holding the remains of Alfred, his third wife Jessie, and her brother Ed Ball. Music and memory, combined in a single structure overlooking the gardens Alfred and Alicia had envisioned. The completed landscape represented one of the finest French-style gardens in North America. The design principles were authentic: geometry, axiality, controlled nature, multiple garden rooms within an overall formal scheme. The execution was flawless, the maintenance was rigorous. The result was a landscape that transported visitors to another time and place, even while remaining firmly rooted in early 20th century Delaware. But these beautiful spaces would witness both joy and profound sorrow. The fountains would continue playing, the hedges would continue growing, the gardens would endure, outlasting the people who built them, becoming a legacy more permanent than any individual life. Chapter 9: The 15-Year War. Coleman DuPont was sick. By 1914, the big athletic man who'd once seemed invincible was struggling with health problems that left him exhausted. He'd been president of DuPont for 12 years, leading the company through explosive growth. But now he needed rest. He needed money. And he owned a lot of DuPont stock. He approached Alfred first. Would Alfred want to buy his shares? 20,000 shares at a fair price. It would give Alfred more control, strengthen his position in the company he'd helped save back in 1902. Alfred was interested, but he wanted to discuss the price, the terms, the timing. Coleman didn't want to wait. While Alfred and Pierre debated the proper way to structure the purchase, Coleman made a different decision. He would sell to Pierre instead. Not 20,000 shares. All of them. Over 77,000 shares of common and preferred stock combined. Pierre acted quickly. He formed DuPont Securities Company with 5 associates. Together they bought Coleman's entire stake. The transaction happened fast, quietly, without consulting the other shareholders. When it was done, Pierre controlled 60% of DuPont Securities, which now held a massive block of company stock. Effectively, Pierre had seized control of the family business. Alfred was furious. Coleman had been his cousin, his business partner for over a decade. They'd bought the company together, built it together, and now Coleman had sold his shares to Pierre behind Alfred's back? The betrayal cut deep. Even worse was Pierre's method: secret negotiations. No opportunity for other shareholders to bid. No transparency. Just a swift power grab that changed everything. Other shareholders were angry too. The stock had increased dramatically in value during World War I as the company supplied explosives to Allied forces. Those shares were worth far more now than when the 3 cousins had bought the company. Pierre had acquired them through what many considered an abuse of his position. He'd been on the board. He'd had inside information. He'd used that advantage to buy stock that other family members would have wanted. Alfred filed a lawsuit in 1916. The claim was straightforward. Pierre had acted as an agent of A.E. Dupont de Nemours when he bought Coleman's shares. He'd had a fiduciary duty to offer them to the company first, or at least to other shareholders. Instead, he'd bought them for himself and his associates. That was breach of trust. The lawsuit became public, acrimonious, bitter. Newspapers covered it. Family members took sides. The 3 cousins who'd once worked together to save the company were now fighting each other in court. Pierre and his allies controlled the board. Alfred and his supporters were pushing back through litigation. The dysfunction was total. Shortly after filing the lawsuit, Alfred faced another blow. In 1916, DuPont shareholders voted to remove him from the board of directors. After 14 years helping run the company, after revolutionizing safety in the powder mills, after contributing to the company's success, Alfred was out. His cousins Coleman and Pierre had sided against him. So had most of the family. The case dragged through federal court. In 1916, the The judge ruled that Pierre had indeed operated in bad faith. The court ordered a stockholder vote. Would shareholders other than Pierre and his group want to purchase the disputed shares? This was Alfred's chance. If enough shareholders supported him, the court could force Pierre to relinquish control. The vote came in 1918. By a ratio of 33 to 13, shareholders declined. They didn't want to buy the shares. The court dismissed Alfred's case. He appealed immediately, but in March 1919, that appeal failed too. Alfred had lost, completely. He was off the board. His lawsuit had failed. Pierre controlled DuPont. The company Alfred had saved in 1902, the business he'd spent nearly 2 decades improving, was no longer his to influence. He still owned stock. He was still the second largest shareholder. But he had no voice in how the company operated. No seat at the table. No power. Pierre and the board had shut him out entirely. Alfred turned to other ventures. He bought newspapers, eventually controlling 9 publications in Delaware. He used them to oppose Coleman's political ambitions and Henry A. DuPont's Senate campaigns. If he couldn't fight his cousins in the boardroom, he'd fight them through the press. He established Nemours Trading Corporation, an investment firm. He started an import-export business in New York. He acquired a majority interest in Delaware Trust Company, a bank that gave him financial independence from DuPont. Alfred was proving he could succeed outside the family business, that he didn't need them. But it wasn't the same. The company had been his life's work. He'd been in those powder mills since age 20. He'd made them safer, more efficient, more profitable. And now he was exiled, pushed out by the very cousins he'd once trusted with his future. Then came 1920. A bad business transaction left Alfred nearly bankrupt. The investments hadn't paid off. The businesses weren't generating enough income. For the first time in his life, Alfred DuPont was facing financial hardship. Not poverty, he still had assets, but real financial pressure. The man who'd once been worth tens of millions was scrambling. In January 1920, his second wife, Alicia, died suddenly of a heart attack. Alfred was 55 years old, nearly deaf from years of working near explosions, blind in one eye from the hunting accident, nearly broke from failed investments, rejected by his family, shut out of the company he'd helped build, and now widowed. He was alone in Nemours, the beautiful chateau surrounded by that wall with broken glass, the house he'd built to prove he belonged. Now it just felt empty. The French furniture, the paintings, the gardens, none of it mattered. Alicia was gone. His place in the company was gone. Everything he'd built over 18 years seemed to be collapsing. The 15-year war with Pierre and Coleman had cost him more than just control of DuPont. It had cost him his position in the family, his sense of purpose, and his financial security. The cousins who'd once bought an empire together had destroyed each other, and Alfred had lost. But his story wasn't over. Against all odds, Alfred DuPont was about to rebuild, not through the company that had rejected him, through something completely different, in a place far from Delaware, with a woman who would prove to be the partner Alicia had never quite been. The broken man in the empty mansion was about to discover he still had fight left in him. Chapter 10, 13 Years of Sorrow. They married in January 1907 with hope, Alfred and Alicia standing before witnesses, finally together after years of scandal and separation. The family had rejected them. Delaware society had shut them out. But they had each other, and they had Nemours rising on 300 acres of farmland. They would build a life together. They would have children. They would prove everyone wrong. The children never came. Not living ones. Alicia had a daughter from her first marriage, young Alicia Maddox, whom Alfred adopted. That gave them one child in the household, but they wanted heirs to fill the 77 rooms they were building. A family to inherit what they'd created. The first pregnancy ended in heartbreak. The baby arrived too soon or too weak, or with complications the doctors couldn't fix. Infant mortality was common in 1910, but knowing that didn't soften the blow. They buried a child who barely had time to live. Alicia tried again. Another pregnancy, another tiny grave. The nursery at Nemours stood empty, rooms designed for children gathering dust instead of toys. The beautiful chateau had no sound of young voices, no life beyond two grieving adults. Medical understanding of pregnancy complications was limited. Doctors couldn't explain why some women carried children to term easily, while others suffered loss after loss. They could only offer sympathies and suggest trying again. The losses took their toll. Alicia grew withdrawn. Alfred threw himself into work at the powder mills, but even that couldn't distract him from the grief waiting at home. Meanwhile, the business war was intensifying. Coleman was selling his shares. Pierre was maneuvering for control. The stress of corporate warfare combined with personal tragedy created an unbearable weight. Every day brought new problems. The company he'd saved was being taken from him. The family he desperately wanted kept slipping away. In 1916, something changed. A French war orphan named Denise arrived at Nemours. She was 11 months old, displaced by World War I, alone in the world. Alfred and Alicia adopted her. The nursery suddenly had an occupant. There was a child's laughter in the house again. Denise wouldn't replace the babies they'd lost, but she gave them someone to love, someone to raise, someone who might inherit this beautiful estate. For a few years, life improved. Denise grew from infant to toddler to young girl. She learned to walk in those marble halls. She played in gardens designed for French royalty. Alfred and Alicia poured their love into this child who'd survived war and loss to join their household. But the business disaster continued. Alfred was removed from the DuPont board in 1916. He lost the lawsuit against Pierre in 1918. By 1919, he was completely shut out of the company he'd spent nearly 2 decades building. His hearing was failing from years of powder mill explosions. The blind eye from the hunting accident served as a constant reminder of past trauma. His finances were collapsing. Alicia watched her husband struggle. The man she'd married had been confident, capable, ready to take on the world. Now he was battling on every front and losing. The corporate position was gone. The money was disappearing. His health was declining. The toll was visible in ways that worried her deeply. In late 1919, they decided to escape. Florida. Warmth. Distance from Delaware and all its painful associations. A chance to leave behind the cold mansion where they'd suffered so much. They boarded a train heading south, looking forward to sun and ocean and temporary relief. Alicia never made it back alive. On the journey, she suffered a heart attack. Sudden, unexpected, fatal. She was 45 years old. Alfred received the news in shock. His wife, his partner through scandal and exile and loss, was gone. No warning, no chance to say goodbye. He returned to Delaware with her body. The funeral was small. The same relatives who'd shunned them in life came to pay respects in death, but their presence felt hollow. Alfred buried Alicia and retreated to Nemours with young Denise. 13 years of marriage, 4 babies lost, a company stripped away, a fortune dwindling, a wife dead. Alfred was 56 years old, nearly deaf, blind in one eye, facing bankruptcy, alone except for an adopted daughter who deserved better than a broken father. The house that had been built to prove they belonged now felt like a prison. The French treasures, the paintings, the elaborate gardens, all of it meaningless without the person he'd built it for. Everything he'd fought for over 18 years had crumbled. He stood in that chateau in the winter of 1920 facing the wreckage of his life. The orphan who'd become a powder man, who'd bought an empire, who'd built a palace, who'd fought his family for love. That version of himself felt like a distant memory. But there was one more chapter left. One more woman who would change everything. One more chance at happiness that no one, least of all Alfred himself, saw coming. Her name was Jessie Ball, and she was already on her way to Delaware. Chapter 11. Jessie Ball Saves a Broken Man. Alfred first met Jessie Ball in 1898. He was 34, unhappily married to Bessie, escaping to Virginia for hunting trips whenever he could. She was 14, living in Ball's Neck, a rural Virginia community where her family had deep roots. They met casually, the way people did in small southern towns, through mutual acquaintances, at social gatherings, nothing remarkable. But Alfred remembered her. Over the next 22 years, as his life went through divorce, scandal, remarriage, business wars, and tragedy, he stayed in touch with Jessie Ball. Letters, occasional visits, a friendship that persisted across distance and circumstance. She knew about his troubles. He knew about her life. The connection remained, quiet but steady. Jessie came from respectable Virginia stock. Her family traced their lineage to Mary Ball, George Washington's mother. That genealogy mattered in the South, where ancestry often counted more than current circumstances. The Balls weren't wealthy, but they were connected, educated, part of the fabric of Virginia society. She'd become a teacher. Starting at age 18 in Lancaster County, Virginia, she taught in rural schools where books were scarce and students came from farm families. In 1909, her family moved to San Diego, California, and Jessie went with them. She continued teaching there, eventually becoming vice principal of an elementary school. She supported her elderly parents. She invested in stocks and real estate, making enough profit to fund college scholarships for students who couldn't afford tuition. She was capable, independent, smart with money. When Alicia died in January 1920, Jessie heard the news. She'd known about Alfred's second marriage, about the scandals, about Nemours. Now she knew he was widowed, struggling, alone, except for his adopted daughter. She sent condolences. Alfred responded. The correspondence continued, grew more frequent, became something more than old friendship. By late 1920, Alfred was writing to Jessie regularly. She was 36. He was 56. 20 years older, worn down by loss and failure. His hearing nearly gone, his fortune depleted. But Jessie saw something in him that others had missed. Not the broken man everyone else saw, the man he could still become if someone believed in him. In January 1921, they married. The wedding was quiet, practical, nothing like the scandalous affair with Alicia. Jessie moved to Nemours, leaving California and her teaching career behind. She became mistress of a chateau she'd never seen before, stepmother to young Denise, wife to a man who needed far more help than he'd probably admitted. The transformation was immediate. Alfred had been drifting, purposeless, unsure what to do with a life that had fallen apart. Jessie gave him direction. She managed the household with efficiency, learned from years of running schools on limited budgets. She organized his finances, pushing him to make smarter investments. She became his advocate, his confidant, his business partner in ways Alicia had never been. Most importantly, she became his interpreter. Alfred's hearing loss had become severe. Conversations were difficult. Business meetings were nearly impossible. Jessie learned to position herself where Alfred could read lips. She repeated important information. She made sure he understood what was being said around him. His disability, which had isolated him, became manageable with her help. Her brother Ed Ball moved to Delaware to work with Alfred. Ed was younger, aggressive, sharp with numbers and business strategy. He and Alfred connected immediately. Ed became the partner Alfred needed now that Pierre and Coleman had pushed him out of DuPont. Together, they started looking for new opportunities. Not in Delaware, where the DuPont family still controlled everything. Somewhere else. Somewhere Alfred could rebuild without fighting his relatives at every turn. Jessie pushed for Florida. The climate would be easier on Alfred's health. The state was growing, developing, full of opportunity. Land was cheap. Banks were small and local, not controlled by powerful families. Alfred could start fresh without the weight of DuPont history hanging over every decision. In 1925, their decision became urgent. Pierre was named Delaware's tax commissioner. The thought of his cousin Pierre examining his finances, his property holdings, his investments, Alfred couldn't tolerate it. The man who'd taken his company would not pick through his personal affairs. They left Delaware, permanently. In 1926, Alfred and Jesse established legal residency in Jacksonville, Florida. They bought 58 acres on the St. Johns River and built a new mansion, not as large as Nemours, not French. This one would be Mediterranean Revival style, appropriate for Florida. Jesse helped design it, choosing furnishings and layouts that suited their needs rather than impressing society. She named it Epping Forest, after the Virginia plantation of Mary Ball Washington, connecting her family history to their new beginning. Alfred purchased land throughout northern Florida. Thousands of acres bought cheap during the state's real estate boom, though he was careful not to overpay like speculators in Miami. He bought Florida National Bank in Jacksonville, giving him control over capital to fund development. He acquired the Apalachicola Northern Railroad and other infrastructure. He started planning Port St. Joe, imagining a workers' community with good jobs, decent housing, fair treatment, all the things he'd cared about since his days in the powder mills. Ed Ball managed many of these ventures, proving as capable as Jesse had promised. The two men worked well together, Ed handling the aggressive negotiation and expansion, while Alfred provided capital and vision. It wasn't DuPont. It would never match the scale of what he'd lost. But it was his, built on his terms, free from Cousin Pierre's interference. Back at Nemours, the mansion sat mostly empty. Alfred and Jesse returned occasionally, but Florida was home now. The chateau, with its wall of broken glass, represented a different life, a different Alfred. The man living in Florida with Jesse was building something new, not proving himself to Delaware society, not fighting family, just working, investing, creating jobs, making a difference in a state that needed capital and vision. Jesse had saved him. Not through grand gestures or dramatic rescues, through steady partnership, practical support, and belief in his ability to rebuild. The broken man who'd stood in Nemours, surrounded by grief, had found purpose again. The orphan who'd become a powder man, who'd lost an empire, who'd buried a wife and dreams, had one more act left. And this time, he wasn't alone. Chapter 12. Exile to Florida. Pierre DuPont's appointment as Delaware Tax Commissioner in 1925 was the final insult. The cousin who'd seized control of the company would now have access to Alfred's financial records, property holdings, tax returns. Pierre could examine every asset, every transaction, every investment. Alfred refused to give him the satisfaction. Within months, he and Jesse made their decision. Permanent relocation. They would establish legal residency elsewhere, removing themselves from Pierre's jurisdiction entirely. Florida offered multiple advantages. The climate would ease Alfred's health problems, the deafness, the blind eye, the general wear of 61 years. Business opportunities existed in a growing market not controlled by established families. Real estate remained available at reasonable prices, especially outside the overheated Miami market where speculators were driving costs to unsustainable levels. Crucially, Florida had no state income tax. Jacksonville became their destination. They purchased 58 acres on the St. Johns River with room for a substantial house and grounds. The property offered river access for the Nemours, Alfred's yacht, which they'd used for previous Florida trips. Live oaks draped with Spanish moss created natural beauty, without requiring the intensive maintenance Nemours had demanded. Jesse worked with architects Marsh and Saxelby to design a Mediterranean Revival mansion. White stucco walls, red tile roof, arched windows and doorways. Courtyards and loggias suited to subtropical living. Nothing like the French chateau in Delaware. This house embraced light and warmth, rather than importing European formality. Jesse planned room layouts based on how they actually lived, not how society expected them to entertain. She named it Epping Forest, honoring the Virginia plantation of Mary Ball Washington, George Washington's mother, and her distant relative. While Jesse managed construction, Alfred planned gardens suited to Florida's climate. Terraced landscapes worked with the topography. Native plants mixed with tropical species. Less rigid than Nemours, more natural. He'd learned that forcing nature into geometric patterns required exhausting effort. Sometimes working with what the land offered made more sense. Ed Ball, Jesse's younger brother, had followed them south and quickly became indispensable. At 36, Ed was ambitious, sharp with financial details, aggressive in negotiations. He saw opportunities where others saw risk. Together, he and Alfred began assembling investments throughout northern Florida. Land purchases came first. Thousands of acres in the Panhandle, the undeveloped northern region most investors ignored while chasing Miami's speculative boom. Cheap prices, timber resources, potential agricultural development. Alfred remembered lessons from his powder mill days: buy undervalued assets, improve them, profit when others finally recognized their worth. When Jacksonville's Florida National Bank came available, Alfred acquired it. Owning a bank meant controlling capital, funding projects without depending on financiers who might have Delaware connections. It also generated steady income through normal operations. A sound business, not speculation. Infrastructure followed. He purchased the Apalachicola Northern Railroad serving the Panhandle region, the St. Joseph Telephone and Telegraph Company. Unglamorous investments that generated steady revenue and gave him influence over regional economic development. Control infrastructure, control growth. Another lesson from DuPont. Port St. Joe became his most ambitious vision. The Gulf Coast town had potential. Deep harbor, railroad access, timber resources. Alfred wanted to transform it into a model community with good jobs, decent housing, fair wages, modern amenities. Not a company town where workers were exploited. Something different. He'd spent his youth alongside powder mill laborers. He knew what they needed, what they deserved. Earl Draper, a prominent city planner, designed the rebuilt town. Comprehensive plans included residential areas, commercial districts, parks, schools, complete infrastructure, years to implement, millions to spend. Alfred was prepared for both. This would be his legacy project, proving his vision extended beyond making money. The work energized him. At DuPont, he'd fought for control of something already built. Here, he was creating from scratch, building towns, funding development, improving infrastructure, making decisions based on what seemed right rather than what boards demanded. Jesse managed their Jacksonville household while Ed handled daily business operations. Alfred remained involved in major decisions but trusted his partners with details. At 60 years old with failing hearing, he needed people he could rely on. Both were proving themselves daily. Back in Delaware, Nemours stood mostly empty except for occasional visits. The mansion represented a different life, preserved but no longer defining him. Pierre controlled DuPont, but Alfred controlled his own future, and that finally was enough. Chapter 13. The Legacy, From Broken Glass to Healing Children. Alfred DuPont died on April 28, 1935. He was 70 years old. His last words, spoken to the doctors and nurses attending him at Epping Forest, were reportedly, "Thank you, doctors. Thank you, nurses. I'll be all right in a few days." He wasn't. Heart failure ended a life that had survived orphaning at 14, powder mill explosions, a hunting accident that cost him an eye, deafness from years of industrial noise, 3 marriages, business betrayals, bankruptcy scares, and exile from his home state. What finally stopped Alfred DuPont was simply age and a heart that had carried too much for too long. Jessie was 51. She'd been married to Alfred for 14 years, pulling him back from the edge of collapse and helping him build a new empire in Florida. Now she faced massive responsibilities as widow of a man whose estate was valued at approximately $40 million. A fortune rebuilt from near ruin through Florida investments, banking, real estate, and infrastructure. But Alfred's will came with specific instructions that would shape Jesse's life for the next 35 years. He'd established the Alfred Firmer DuPont Testamentary Trust, managed by 3 trustees, Jessie herself, her brother Ed Ball, and Alfred's son-in-law Reginald Huidekoper, with Florida National Bank serving as corporate trustee. His directives were clear: support the Nemours Foundation, provide care for elderly and disabled residents of Delaware, and most importantly, build and maintain a children's hospital. Alfred had always cared about people who couldn't help themselves. Workers in dangerous mills, children born into poverty, elderly people without resources. His will reflected those concerns, channeling his fortune toward healing and helping, rather than simply enriching descendants. But it also created complications that would fuel lawsuits for decades. Delaware claimed too much money was going to Florida operations instead of Delaware beneficiaries. In the 1970s, Delaware's Attorney General sued Ed Ball and other trustees, alleging they'd diverted assets away from charitable needs. A 1980 settlement eventually stipulated that no more than 50% of annual distributions could be spent outside Delaware. Legal battles continued for years, bitter and complex, exactly the kind of infighting Alfred had endured during his lifetime, now extending beyond his death. But the core mission survived. In 1940, the Alfred DuPont Institute opened in Wilmington, a pediatric orthopedic hospital dedicated to treating disabled children regardless of their family's ability to pay. Children with birth defects, injuries, diseases affecting bones and mobility could receive world-class care at no cost. Alfred's dream was becoming real. Industrial wealth transformed into healing. Jessie devoted herself to fulfilling those wishes. She served as president of both the Nemours Foundation and the Trust, making decisions about fund distribution and pushing for expansion of medical services. She contributed substantial amounts from her personal fortune. By the time she died in 1970, her personal contributions totaled over $22 million, separate from Alfred's trust. She also maintained Nemours in Delaware. For decades, it sat closed to the public, a private memorial accessible only to family and foundation officials. Preserved, maintained, kept exactly as it had been when Alfred and Alicia lived there. Gardens bloomed according to their French geometric patterns, but no one except caretakers walked those paths. Ed Ball managed the business side, expanding holdings aggressively. He grew Florida National Bank into a major regional institution, developed Port St. Joe, invested in timber, real estate, transportation infrastructure. Under his management, assets grew exponentially. Critics accused him of prioritizing growth over charitable distribution. Supporters insisted he was securing resources for long-term impact. Debates raged through courtrooms and boardrooms for years. When Jessie died in September 1970 at Nemours in Wilmington, she left her own fortune to a separate foundation, the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund, which continues supporting colleges, churches, and scholarships. Her estate was valued at approximately $42 million, one of the largest in Florida history at that time. She was buried in the Carillon Tower at Nemours, alongside Alfred and Ed Ball, who had died in 1981. For decades after, Nemours remained closed. Deterioration was slow but inevitable despite maintenance efforts. Gardens required constant work. The foundation debated what to do with a house that was historically significant but served no functional purpose, couldn't generate revenue, cost money to maintain. But Alfred's will had specified that Nemours should be preserved for the pleasure and benefit of the public. In 2005, the foundation committed $39 million to complete restoration. Nemours closed for 3 years while world-class conservators refurbished furniture, fabrics, tapestries, interior finishes, paintings, sculptures. Electrical systems were replaced. The 800,000-gallon reflecting pool was drained, repaired, restored. Gardens were replanted according to historical records. Every detail mattered. On May 1, 2008, Nemours reopened to the public. For the first time since Alfred built it nearly a century earlier, anyone could visit. Visitors could walk the Long Walk, see the Temple of Love, explore the maze, tour the 77 rooms filled with French treasures. Today, the Nemours Foundation operates one of the nation's largest integrated pediatric health systems. Nemours Children's Hospital in Delaware and Nemours Children's Hospital in Florida provide care to over 250,000 children annually. Hospitals, clinics, research programs, medical education, everything needed to fulfill what Alfred envisioned, caring for children who need help. That wall still stands, topped with broken glass. Once it kept out family members who'd rejected Alfred. Now it's simply part of history, a reminder of pain transformed into purpose. An orphan who lost everything built something that saves children's lives. A mansion constructed from bitterness became a foundation for healing. And a fortune made from explosives now funds hope.